Republican long shot Neel Kashkari goes on the attack in his debate against Democratic Governor Jerry Brown. Environmentalists are furious as fracking for gas and oil is greenlighted in California based on a sketchy study. And Chula Vista schools fail to make testing accommodations for disabled students mandated by state law. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome. It's Friday, September 5th. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Chris Genuine. He's the editor of the TimesOfSanDiego.com. Susan White, editor of Inside Climate News, and KPBS education reporter Matthew Bowler. With a big lead and a big advantage in fundraising and a solid record to run on, Democrat Jerry Brown rightly saw his debate against GOP challenger Neel Kashkari as an opportunity for Kashkari. And Kashkari, the former Goldman Sachs executive, took advantage by coming out swinging in their feisty one-hour affair. Now, Chris, how would you characterize the nature of what went on there?
Well, it was certainly a spirited debate, and what we saw was a very well-spoken, very quick on his feet newcomer sparring with a political veteran who, frankly, came across as he's seen it before. He's been through this before. Governor Brown was blunt. Governor Brown took many of those punches and punched back. But I think Kashkari got off some zingers like the crazy train, which came up again and again throughout that debate.
What were the main topics, the main themes that they went after?
I think spending on the high-speed rail was one of the main themes. Kashkari is saying it's simply too expensive. We should put the money into water. Of course, it was a proposition, so it's kind of difficult to move away from that. And the governor speaking again and again of how he found what he said was a state like Greece with difficult economic problems, and that he's turned it around. And if we stick with Governor Brown, we'll have more of this turnaround. Right,
and he was proud of that stewardship, as you say. Here's a clip. Let's see what he had to say.
You don't really have much expectation to win because things have been accomplished in Sacramento. The budget deficit, this was the big thing. They're calling California a failed state, another Greece. It's now a surplus, a serious surplus. That's something very impressive. The jobs, we got 1.4 million jobs since the recession. Education, they were cutting arts programs and science and performance. And now we've injected $2,000 per student because of Proposition 30 that the voters passed. So I think people know California is not perfect. We got our problems. But boy, what momentum do we now have?
All right. Did he do a pretty good job of defending himself there?
I thought he came across as the kind of governor that you can trust. He's seen it before. He's done it before. I think that a newcomer like Kashkari, as well spoken as he is, has to have some more experience behind him before he's going to convince voters. And it's one debate. I think the
only debate, it looks
the
like.
only debate. The governor said at the end he wasn't planning for a follow-up. You know, Governor Brown is well ahead. Some polls show him 20 points ahead. And I think that's going to be a very big lead for someone to overcome based on good performance, better than expected performance in just one debate.
Right. And so Kashkari came out, as we say, swinging. Let's see one example of that here in this clip.
Look, I don't think Governor Brown did nearly enough on Tesla and any number of businesses. Governor Brown frequently says, well, businesses come and go. It's not businesses coming and going. It's Tesla, it's Toyota, it's Schwab, it's Nestle, on, and they're all going. There's a real problem. You know, in the 4 years that Governor Brown's been governor, we've been ranked 50th out of 50 states. 50, 50, 50, and 50, 4 years in a row for business climate.
So it's pretty clear how the difference is there. Brown says, we did a good job. He says, oh, no, wait, not so fast.
Well, you know, actually, Brown had a pretty good comeback. He pointed out that the cars that Tesla make come off an assembly line in Fremont, California. And if you look at the news on that plant decision, one of the primary considerations for Tesla was the fact that there are lithium mines in Nevada. And that's the primary source.
For this big battery
plant. Yes, you've got to have lithium to make these batteries. So it wasn't a clear-cut decision that put it in California versus put it in Nevada. You need to be close to the resources.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it did get testy. We got one more clip here. We're going to show just how feisty it got at times.
You had a choice between fighting for the civil rights of poor kids and fighting for the union bosses who funded your campaigns. You sided with the union bosses. You should be ashamed of yourself, Governor. I'm going to fight for the kids. I'm going to fight for the kids. I want you to know that.
That makes no sense at all. That is so false.
It's absolutely true, Governor.
No,
it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true.
You know, it's interesting. I happened to be listening on the radio at that time, and it occurred to me that it was a wonderful political statement by the challenger there, because why is that mutually exclusive? That was his assumption. You can't be for teachers and kids. You got to be from one or the other. Of course, the teachers are a big supporter of Jerry Brown.
Yeah, and I think Governor Brown rightly said that you know, he, as the head of the state of California, he had to defend that suit. I mean, you're in a position where you have to do what the law requires in that case. But it's a wonderful thing to seize on if you're the challenger, and I think that's what Kashkari did very well throughout the debate. Is he seized on issues that are controversial, and he pressed home. And if you're, you know, this is his first run for any political office. He does have significant public experience as the man behind the TARP program, the Troubled Asset Recovery Program.
And at Goldman Sachs before that,
exactly.
As Governor Brown noted, because he had that wonderful line about, well, you were the arsonist here, Goldman Sachs helping to lead us off a cliff, and then you went in with TARP and the bailout here. It's kind of the arsonist putting out the fire. Thank you. That was a pretty good line. Susan?
Can I say something about the crazy train?
Absolutely.
This drives me crazy. and what's crazy is that we don't have trains like this throughout our country. And a couple years ago, my organization sent a reporter to Germany, and he wrote about what they're doing. He traveled everywhere, seamlessly. Everything is interconnected. We are so far behind the rest of the world, including even some countries that are less developed than ours. It's shocking, and I don't know whether this particular, I haven't studied this particular project, but it's something. We're making a start, and we are so far behind. Mm-hmm. The craziness is that we don't have it. These
I think that's a really important comment, because you can criticize something like that, but what are the alternatives? And the alternatives are more highways. And it's expensive to build highways. And you can't just say the train is expensive, we shouldn't do it. If you're not going to do that, what are you going to invest in?
The other stuff's more expensive. Let's shift now. We only have a couple minutes left in this segment to a debate that you happen to moderate here locally. Of course, that was for District 6. It's the only San Diego City Council race that's in play here this November. Tell us about the two candidates there and what they were saying.
It was an interesting debate. It was two very well-spoken candidates, not a lot of fireworks. I think between these two candidates, it's a difference of degree. Chris Cate, Republican, Carol Kim, Democrat. She has a lot of union support. Chris Cate has the support of the political establishment. Mayor Faulkner, former Mayor Jerry Sanders, he was a political aide to Faulkner. Carol Kim, an educational consultant. What is at stake, though, is very important, because it's the 6-3 Democratic majority in the council is really at stake here. If Cate wins, and he got 47% of the vote in the primary, then it's likely to be a 5-4, and therefore a not veto-proof Democratic majority.
And if Kim wins, obviously they keep the veto-proof, which is temporarily.
Exactly, the same as it has been for a while.
All right, we've got a clip here of both candidates here. First the Republican Cate, and then the Democrat Carol Kim.
I'm the only business person in this race who's actually started and operated my own small business. I know what it takes every single day to balance a budget, to make payroll, and to create jobs in our city.
I'm going to make sure that there's a system that allows us to really see and track how our monies are being spent, whether or not we're receiving the services that we are paying for, and if they're not going well, if things are going sideways, then let's figure that out.
All right, we got about a minute to go here in this segment. They agreed on a lot of stuff. Any key differences?
The key difference was, again, it's all in the way they would approach problems. Let's take the police department. Everybody agrees that we need to spend more money on police. Chris Cate's position was, let's do what the council has already done, which is to vote for a significant increase in the budget and let the professionals figure out how to divide that up. Carol Cate said, let's spend the money specifically on raises for officers. She would raise raise the salaries 5% each year for the next 5 years, which, if you do the math and you add the compounding, is about 27% over 5 years. So same intent, but different approaches. Pay more to the police officers versus increase the budget for the entire department.
Now, how do you handicap a race like this? I mean, no money for big polls. It's only one small segment of the city that's really voting on it. You kind of have to wait for Election Day. Huh?
Well, I was wondering, too, if because it's an off year, do you think that Republican has an advantage?
I think Cade has an advantage, at least on the surface. He has the support and the endorsement of Mitz Lee, who came in number 3 in the race. So he already had 47%. He picked up the support of the number 3 person, and that may be enough to get to just over 50%.
And we should note this: the district was redrawn. District 6 used to be Donna Fry's district, and then Lori Zaff, and of course now it's a heavy Asian population in that district, and these two candidates are both Asian.
Both of Asian background.
And it's funny, they keep saying, even the organization supporting him, it would be the first Asian American council member in a long, long time. But Todd Gloria is part Filipino, so I don't know how that jumps.
One very interesting thing about the debate is that it got a lot of. It was a big audience, about 100 people. But in the audience were Scott Sherman, council member, and Lori Zaff, the current council member.
Okay. All right, we're going to shift now to another topic that's got a lot of moving parts to it. California seems like the last place to extract oil and gas with a process that requires huge amounts of water and can trigger earthquakes. But backers of the controversial drilling method known as fracking appear to, have just gotten a green light from a federal agency. And Susan, let's start by briefly explaining what fracking is.
Fracking is a process that has enabled the oil and gas industry to extract oil and gas deposits that were once considered uneconomical to extract.
Couldn't get to them.
They're deep or they're in rock formations that's difficult to get to. But fracking allows it pushes large amounts of water with sand and small amounts of chemicals into the earth, and it explodes the earth around, and then the gas molecules come out and go up to the surface.
Divides those boulders and rocks and all that stuff.
And you think of it as a spider web under the ground too. You can go down once and you can go in many different places. The process is used a little differently depending on the geology. Our geology is different. As I understand it, my organization has not done a lot of reporting per se in California yet.
Are we doing fracking here? Is it happening in California?
I'm sure we're doing fracking here because fracking is not, everyone says, oh, it's an old process. It is, but it has been tweaked. So the modern fracking is not what fracking was.
Way back when.
So,
Now, there have been many environmental problems and complaints elsewhere in the country. Give us the high points of that.
Well, this study focused primarily on water.
This was the one done by the California Council on Science and Technology.
Right, and it was for the BLM and
independent agency, supposedly, like organization.
Yeah, and it seems from what I've read that people agree this was a good study. They did as well as they could. There's very little information out there.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute.
But what has happened in other places, there have been reports of water contamination, especially in Pennsylvania, and there is some in other places too. But there are bigger problems there that aren't being addressed because there's also the problem of air pollution. And my organization has been reporting on that throughout the country, and we're focusing on Texas now. And I think that's something that is...
And what specifically now? What's causing the pollution?
Gas and oil, fracking is just one part of the production process. And the production process is huge. It means extracting the gas, you have waste pits, you have compressor stations. It's like bringing an industrial process into the area. Hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of water, bringing water in and carrying the contaminated water out. It's a big industrial process, and there aren't very many rules regulating it. So you have in Texas families that we've written about where many of them don't have a lot of money. They bought a little piece of land in a part of Texas where there was nothing, and they're living a nice life, and all of a sudden they're surrounded by 50 wells, and trucks and production facilities. And we've written about people who can no longer breathe. Anyone, if you have a health problem already, and the laws just aren't there to protect them, particularly in Texas.
Well, the idea here in California on this particular study was, let's find out what harm could it do before we allow these leases on federal lands. And the study was so curious because the conclusion was, well, we don't really know what harm it can do, but we don't really have any information to base that on. And that was taken by, apparently, the oil companies or the energy companies rejoiced at this, and the federal government says, okay, fine, let's go ahead with the leases. I wonder if there's an analogy here to the FDA in a medical, a pharmaceutical product or a medical technique, where they say, hey, we don't really have any information, don't know if it'll harm anybody, but we don't have any information that will, go on ahead. I mean, it doesn't.
And that's what we're doing. And then you have to reverse the process. Then you have to prove harm. And when there's no data, how do the people prove harm? There's a court case in Texas now that is involving the air pollution, and it's the first court case of its kind in the country, we think. The people won a couple $1 million, or more than $1 million, because they said their health had been damaged. But there's very little scientific evidence. Proving these cases is almost impossible. So there you are.
Now, I think there's been a lot of development of fracking in 3 states, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and Texas. And I wonder if we have to take into account a kind of a trade-off between the potential environmental impacts, but then the economic development impact. And Governor Brown has said he sees this as a potentially fabulous economic boom for California.
And it is. It can be. But the thing is that so far as a country, we're looking at the economic benefits and the stability of a domestic oil and gas supply, but we pay lip service. It can be regulated. And I've been working on this subject since 2008, actually, editing stories about this. And what I've learned in that time, it can be made way safer. There are all kinds of things that can be done, but you have to have the regulations, and then you have to allocate the money to enforce the regulations.
Well, and you talk about jobs and the economy, and of course that's a very valid thing. The volatility in the Middle East, and we've certainly seen that, and the oil supply from there, and the domestic supplies have surged here with techniques like this. But the question is, down the road, what are the costs of pollution? What are the costs of climate change that have to weigh into this factor of jobs and production now?
I would love to see factored in, when you see the price of a gallon of gasoline or the unit of natural gas that you use at your house, that you would factor in the environmental costs too, because that would give you a realistic picture. But as I said, many of these things can be mitigated, especially the water contamination, because they can cement the wells better. But you have to have someone there to make sure that they are cemented.
And enforce that. What do the environmentalists want to do now in light of this report, and apparently the green light is on here in California? What would they like to see happen?
I'm not really well versed on what the environmentalists want in California per se, but I think nationally, among many groups, is stop fracking, which seems somewhat unrealistic.
Unrealistic, right?
But there are other groups that say, let us have it regulated, let us make it safer. But the push by industry and politicians who are supported by the industry, the pushback against regulations is tremendous.
All right. Undoubtedly, we're going to hear a lot more on this. I know we'll be doing more reporting. Certainly Inside Climate News will be doing more reporting on that. All right. Taking tests is not the most enjoyable thing for many students, but for those with dyslexia, it's exceptionally difficult. California law requires school districts to make accommodations for students with this disability. But some parents and teachers in the Chula Vista Elementary School District are angry that 2 sets of tests were recently given without any disability accommodation. And Matt, let's start with what tests are we talking about here?
We're talking about the Common Core test. In California, that's the Smarter Balanced. That's the test.
The one we've all been hearing about. The new one.
We've all been hearing about.
Right.
And then Chula Vista has its own local measures test. This is a test they use to determine where students are academically and how well teachers are doing teaching those students.
Okay. And why does dyslexic students have such trouble with these kinds of tests?
Well, dyslexia is a sort of a difference in cognitive process. So the dyslexics interpret written information differently than other people interpret written information. They also tend to have a harder time communicating that written information, writing that information down once they're trying to express themselves, particularly through an exam of this kind.
So it may not be an issue of intelligence or knowledge, it's simply a way of...
Dyslexics are often highly intelligent. I mean, you know, Einstein is most famously dyslexic. I don't think anybody would call him stupid. But what they tend to do is they tend to also test very high in certain areas, and then they tend to be slower in other areas. So they'll test very high in math and science, but then not as well in areas of reading and writing.
So they might be behind grade level, as you pointed out in your story, in reading and writing, for example, and actually above grade level in math and science. Now, your story also noted that it's not a small percentage of the student population we're talking about.
No, it's about 17% of everyone in the world they determine is possibly dyslexic. Well, that's
to some degree.
To some degree or another, it's definitely a scalable thing. So, you know, I mean, there's a huge amount of kids. But, you know, when you have a classroom full of 20 students, you know, if 15% of those students, that's, you know, two to three kids in that class, that's significant enough to be relevant in the class, but not significant enough overall to like determine the sort of the conceptual direction of the teaching.
All right, so on a personal note, we have a clip of a parent, Justina Eaton, and her daughter Abby. They talk about specifically their experience here in Chula Vista with that test. Let's hear what they say.
When I told them it was illegal, they're like, well, you have to understand your child still has to be held accountable, and we have to be able to test her even though she is dyslexic.
It's hard. And you might not think it's hard, but some people, it's hard for them. And I'm one of those people.
And she's crying at the table, telling me, I'm stupid, Mommy, I'm stupid. I mean, what do you do? What do you do for that? I mean, what do you know, at that point, learning is not happening anymore.
Now, Susan, you were telling me before we went on the air that you have a personal aspect of this situation with your granddaughter, and they were saying in the clip there, what do you do? And your family has taken some measures. Explain
Well,
that.
I heard Matt's story on the radio, and I was immediately in touch with my daughter-in-law about it because my granddaughter is really, really smart and has had a terrible time in school, and last year they had to pull her out. And what really alarms me about this kind of story is, yes, it's a problem for the schools and it's a problem for the teacher, but for each of those individual children, like Abby or like my granddaughter, it's personally devastating. And with my granddaughter, they put her in, you know, she was reading books that were not interesting to her at a very low level. And as soon as they pulled her out of school, she was reading on her own, at her own pace, and was reading very high level books. But it broke my heart to hear what Abby said, because how many kids face these problems without any help from the teacher? Their parents don't know what to do, and they're left.
Now, what are the accommodations that the school under state law is supposed to do here?
Well, there's all kinds of accommodations you can make. You can give the kids more time. One accommodation is to actually modify the questions. So if the kid is reading at a third grade level, let's say they're in fifth grade and they read at a third grade level, but they're doing math at, let's say, a 10th grade level, which happens a lot with dyslexics. They're given a word problem to do in math. You have to word the problem so that it's at a third grade level, but the math still needs to be 10th grade. It needs to be advanced enough. So it's actually very complicated and requires a lot of very smart teachers to do.
And you got to
but it
make
can be
that
done.
accommodation. Now, what did the school district down in Chula Vista there say about why they didn't make these accommodations?
Well, they said that they gave a few different answers. They told me, the assistant superintendent told me he would only speak to the Smarter Balance test. He told me that they're working on that. That was the extent of the answer from him. But Abby's mom, Justina, told me that they said to her that they only got the test within a week and they weren't able to make the accommodations for the Smarter Balance test. However, that doesn't explain the local measures test because they've been giving that for 15 years now.
Yeah.
And SDUSD, San Diego Unified School District, tells me they got a list from California and the Smarter Balance people as to what the accommodations should be and how to make these accommodations in January. And they gave this test in May.
And they made the accommodations.
And they made the accommodations. They also give the individual teachers the right to make accommodations in classroom as they see fit.
Right. Chris, did you have a question there?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that this is going on with so much. We know so much about these kinds of conditions.
It's a very 1980s discussion to have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone agrees dyslexia exists, and the point is to teach these kids, and you know that debate is long since over. Right. You know.
And it really infuriates me when I hear them say, oh, we didn't get the test in time or whatever. That's about process, and we should be looking at individual children. And do you want me to read my little...
Susan, we have a few seconds left. This is a poem that your granddaughter had written. Just give us a few of those lines.
And this is after she was began homeschooling. If you are out of your shell, it's good sometimes. If you're inside your shell, it's good sometimes. If you are in your shell, you're protected, but you can't see the world, only your shell. I am in my shell now. I will come out soon.
Yes, well, that's very moving.
So moving.
Yeah, and the intelligence is clear there. All right, we've got to wrap it up. Thank you so much. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Chris Genuine of timesofsandiego.com, Susan White of Inside Climate News, and Matt Bowler of KPBS News. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.